Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Cambridge University and of RUSI, two institutions I'm very happy to be affiliated to, and on behalf of BISA as well, I'm really very pleased to be chairing this very unique event today. As was said earlier, a way we hope to bring practitioners and academics a bit closer together on a particularly interesting theme. And I think we've brought together a really fascinating group of people in order to address this particular question of the Middle East, geopolitics, and international studies today. Um, I think that those of you who have worked on these issues in the past will remember that divides within the region, at least in terms of how analysts used to approach it, were mostly about very reductionist notions of Sunni versus Shi'i or Saudi versus Iran and Shi'i crescents and so on and so forth. And over the past decade, it's been increasingly pointed out by analysts and academics alike that such frames simply don't work and frankly never worked. But what's different today is that I think Western academia and policy networks are slowly but surely having to make the analysis and the work that they do become more relevant and frankly intelligible to communities of the region, because increasingly academics and analysts on the region are of the region and speak the languages of the region or originate from the region and spend a huge amount of time in the region. So they're able to see a lot of those nuances a lot better, at least in my personal experience over the past decade. And I'm very pleased that we've brought people who are just like that today, people who may be Western, but are also people who are deeply familiar with the region, and people in the region who are deeply familiar with the West, who'll be able to talk to us a little bit today about how they see this particular question around Middle Eastern geopolitics and international studies um, from the perspective of the particular geographic spaces that they look at. So I wanted to give you a brief introduction to all of those people and give you just a couple of minutes myself on the new alliances within the region before we take about sort of 5 to 7 minutes from each person to elaborate on what they thought the most interesting things to look at are today, and then we'll open up for a discussion and then questions. So the people that we have today, Dr. Dina Esfandiary, who is a senior advisor to the Middle East and North Africa team at Crisis Group, who focuses on Iran and the Gulf Arab states. Dr. Ziya Meral, who is a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and also a senior resident fellow at the UK Army Centre for Historical Analysis and Conflict Research at Sandhurst. His research focuses on modern Turkey and the Middle East. Dr. Lina al-Khatib, who is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, and her research mainly focuses on the Levant, but is far more broad than that. And Dr. Bader Al-Saif, who's an assistant professor of history at Kuwait University and a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Centre, where he focuses on the history and politics of the Middle East, particularly the Gulf. Now, as I said at the beginning of this, before I hand over to our wonderful panel of speakers, it used to be that we talked about just Saudi versus Iran, and I think that we've cracked that, thankfully. And the question is what are these new poles in the region and what are they based on? And I won't get too much into what I think that they're based on, because I think that's a subject for incredible discussion. But what are these poles? So we have the Egypt, Saudi, uh, Emirati pole on the one side, which becomes crystallized, particularly around 2014, 2015. And in opposition to that, the Turkey, Qatari, and loose Muslim Brotherhood networks of the region on the other. And we've seen those poles become more and more, I think, essential, really, in understanding a lot of the conflicts in the region, whether we're looking at the Yemen, whether we're looking at Libya, and increasingly in Syria as well. And there are other ways, geopolitically speaking, that these are incredibly important to sort of parsing out what is actually happening on the ground. The differences between these poles are a subject of great debate and great discussion. You know, partisans of each pole will try to sort of big up, as it were, the positives of their particular axis. But I think from an international studies point of view, it's that age-old question about, you know, what are the interests of these particular countries and why have they joined these alliances together? It's because they feel that their own interests are best served in that regard. It's certainly not about revolution and support for democracy and so on. Otherwise, we would have seen all of these countries support the uprising in Sudan more recently. We would have seen them support the uprising in Bahrain back in 2011. And of course, we saw nothing of the kind. We saw opposition actually to those uprisings. It's certainly not always against revolution either, because when it came to Libya in 2011, the constituent elements of these polls, they supported the uprising in Libya and in Syria for that matter as well, even though they later on supported different actors within these particular countries. So I think that the nuance of the differences between these polls is quite interesting to get into. But I'm not going to talk too much about that because I really do want to have our panel get us a bit more deeper into how this looks on a more, you know, geographic sort of level. And I'd like to ask Dr. Dina Esfandiary to take us away with the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hisham, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be amongst you. So just some initial thoughts, I guess, from an Iranian angle on the topics that you've highlighted. First, I think when you look at Iran in the region, you have to look at a couple of different things. The first of that is what drives its foreign policy. What are the drivers of its foreign policy? And we may think that those of Iran they're different, they're ideological, they're, you know, revolutionary. I actually think that while those may have been the Islamic Republic's initial drivers of its foreign policy, it's lessened somewhat today. And today it's pretty similar to other countries. It's you know, nationalism, it's internal politics and infighting, it's economic. Its goals are very similar to those of other countries. So it's things like preserving its territorial integrity, securing its borders, ensuring long-term development. All of these things feed into how Iran makes foreign policy decisions in the region, and impacts how it takes these decisions. Also, the context, of course, the context in the region makes a big difference. So, for example, how Iran perceives its context, which is obviously incredibly different to how other countries in the region will perceive Iran's context. Iran sees itself as being encircled. It feels the need to insert itself into countries in the region so that it can take the battle away from Iran's borders, so that Iran itself, Iranian territory itself, isn't at risk, because last time Iran's territory was at risk, other than ISIS, was during an 8-year devastating war with Iraq. And so those are the things that feed into Iranian psyche, and those are the things that they want to avoid. So very quickly, because it's really hard to do a summary of how Iran sees things at the moment in the region, and obviously I'm happy to answer questions later. I'll just look a little bit, give you a big overview of how Iran sees things at the moment. First, it feels itself increasingly militarized, and there's a greater willingness to lash out in the region, in part because of President Trump's maximum pressure campaign over the course of the last few years. That's also led internally to a certain amount of unity within a pretty, usually a pretty fluid and combative state of internal politics. And then over the weekend, we saw the results of the Iranian elections, which I'm sure you may want to discuss during the Q&A. So yeah, there's greater unity in general over the course of the last few months, years of the Iranian system in support of Iran's response to maximum pressure, which was maximum resistance. This has meant that Iran has basically lashed out in the region. It from Iran's perspective, the activities that it's been carrying out in the region is very much a way for it to send a message to everybody, not just in the region, but also outside the region, particularly targeted at the US and Europe, to show what Tehran is capable of doing should it want to. Here, this is where we have reached. These are the things that we can do. So essentially, you better watch out and stop pushing our buttons, which I think is the message that was trying to come across. Another big issue for Iran, obviously, is the nuclear deal. On that front, there's a little bit of exhaustion, both within Iranians, but also within the Iranian political elite, and some surprise at where they find themselves today after all these years of negotiations. Are we still talking about this issue? There's real dialogue fatigue when it comes to the nuclear issue. But that very much shapes the way that Iran views the region and beyond, because simply because every country that has wanted to engage with Iran before the nuclear deal couldn't, because the nuclear deal was kind of like the first barrier that everybody faced when it came to talking to the Iranians. And so for them, they also, as a result of that, they also view it that way. So any discussion on Iran, any study on Iran, any study on Iranian foreign policy making, it all has to at some point dwell on the nuclear negotiations, because they are the one big area that kind of defined Iranian foreign policy making for such a long time. So also something to take into consideration when you do any kind of study on Iran. And actually, given the way things are going, likely that will be the case for the foreseeable future, at least until that's resolved. And then some other things that are interesting to watch when it comes to Iranian foreign policy making has been this kind of dichotomy between, are we looking east? Are we looking west? Are we not looking anywhere and focusing on ourselves? That's very much been present in the way that Iranian officials have been making decisions on their foreign policy, but also on their own internal domestic policy making. And that's very much a product of, again, the nuclear negotiations, the years of sanctions, the efforts to isolate Iran, which has kind of forced Iran to pivot and to look east. And you kind of see this move back and forth for the Iranians, even over the course of the last few years, as they've tried to explore, once again, opening up to the West, it not working out so well, pivoting back to looking east. But the whole time, this debate going on inside Iran about whether this is something worth doing, or whether they should just shut themselves off and boost this resistance economy, which would go along with their policy of resistance, and just kind of build their own self-sufficiency. And that debate continues. So I think I'll stop there. I think that's quite a lot. And then again, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
It's wonderful. Thank you. What I wanted to do is take just one question, using my prerogative as chair, to you, in order to bring us also to this part of the panel that relates to international studies. So you mentioned that there's a new government, which the election results sort of were announced, and we now have a new government in Iran. My question to you is, really, does this matter that much? We've had a process where there's a new head of government come into play. Does that really matter in the context of Iran, in the same way that it might matter in other countries that have democratic processes? Or are we really talking about an overriding concern of what the vast majority of the Iranian political elite views as Iran's national interest? So that the sort of shifting of one person at not quite the top, because he's not the top, but someone close to the top, as it were, does that really make a difference or not? I know it's a bit provocative, but I think it also tease out for a lot of our students and our academics that are watching this to consider how they should be framing this sort of development in Iran's modern political history.
So I think I think the short answer is it depends what you're looking at. Domestically, I think it will matter because it will make a big impact on the daily lives of average Iranians. It will matter on social rights, on their ability to write what they want to say what they want to say, demonstrate what they want to demonstrate. It will have an impact on that. That's not to say, again, that the president is the end all and be all in Iran, definitely isn't, but he will have some kind of sway on politics internally and the general feeling in Iran. In foreign policy, it's a little bit more complicated. I think Iran's grand strategy, if you can call it that way, though I'm not sure there is much of a grand strategy, won't change much. And that's largely because decision-making doesn't lie, it's not within the president's mandate when it comes to foreign policy. It's usually the Iranian deep state, the Revolutionary Guards, the supreme leader in his office. They're the ones that get a say in what Iran does on foreign policy. But the president does matter on tone, which may not seem like such a big deal for those of us who are outside the country watching Iranian foreign policy and watching Iran do what it does in the region, for example. But it does matter if you're negotiating with the Iranians. A different tone makes negotiations difficult. If you have a hardliner in place who is more ideological, has more revolutionary zeal, isn't as technocratic, as pragmatic, it just drags negotiations on. It makes them more difficult. It just makes life more difficult. The only upside, and I'll actually draw an interesting parallel with the internal US political scene, I think there's a lot of mirroring effect going on there, is that if you have a hardliner government with a hardliner supreme leader and a hardline Revolutionary Guards, the system tends to agree. There's a little bit less infighting, which means if you are able to overcome those barriers that this change in tone will present, you end up having a little bit more of a lasting deal that faces less internal debate if you're able to get that through.
Thank you so much. That's actually very enlightening, and I'm sure for a lot of our students and academics as well. I'd like to move on to Dr. Bader Al-Saif, who I introduced earlier, and I'd love to hear what he has to say, and I'm sure that all of you will as well, on how this impacts the Gulf more particularly. So please, Bader, tfaddal.
Thank you, Hisham. Good evening from Kuwait, everyone. Pleasure being with you all. So I was given the impossible task of speaking about the Gulf and its geopolitics in 7 minutes. So I'll try
7
my
minutes.
best. 7 minutes, time me. So look, many view the Gulf as a bastion of stability and continuity when looking at a fractured Arab order, while others do sense as, some kind of ever-shifting dynamics. And look, the Gulf, like almost anywhere else, is a mix of both. Where it gets tricky and exciting for me and for spectators of the Gulf is the ability to identify and differentiate between real changes and that what remains the same regardless of seeming change. Let me give you an example. So the Gulf was off to a good start this year with Al-Ula agreement. It seems like a momentous moment, right? We finally have the Gulf, quote unquote, united. The almost 4-year rift that ripped families and governments apart came to a spectacular end after an hour-long GCC meeting, a signed document, lots of behind-the-scenes understandings and gatherings. This may seem like a moment of change, but not quite. It was not the first time, nor will it be the last, that the Gulf states fight one another. Okay, so that's something that needs to be laid out there. And it was also done in a way that speaks to a process in the making, which also speaks to other processes that happen. They are not really events as much as they are processes. The results will only unfold with time. The reconciliation is underway. It's not a finished project. We don't have clear results. Various meetings are taking place. Kuwait has been hosting between Qatar and the other states. So we need to keep that in mind. And also keeping in mind that neither the root causes of the conflict nor the competing visions out there in the region have disappeared. The ensuing detente is useful given that only respectful dialogue, I believe, can lead to real results. And in light of the region's shifting dynamics and, upcoming grand events, we have the Expo later this year in Dubai, we have the World Cup next year in Doha. So they really want to hone it down. But this detente, I would say, is another chapter in a region that suddenly found itself after the 2010-2011 uprisings in a position of increased power vis-a-vis weakened traditional Arab centers, whether it be Egypt, Iraq, or Syria. So these competing visions in the Gulf have been long in the making, and I'm happy to speak about those later on in the Q&A. But the Gulf has been pushed to the limelight, I would argue, based on its actions and reactions to the Arab uprisings, whether it's the uprisings alone or perceptions of waning American interest in the Middle East, rising Iranian meddling, inroads on the nuclear file, increased Russian, Turkish, Israeli interests in strengthening their own understanding in the Gulf and how that could impact on them. So today, most Gulf states are not the only predictable welfare states that most often resort to foreign aid to enable their policies abroad. I think that's part of the past. They now shape and influence policies way beyond their turf, with money being one of many tools. Military, economic, other soft power interventions have been attested, whether in other Arab states, in the Horn of Africa, and even now in the visible changes in the security architecture. With, the Abrahamic Accords is one example, Turkish military cooperation in Qatar and Kuwait is another example. This is all happening, and if I may add Islam into the mix, along with the perception that there are shifts in Islam and in the understanding of Islam from the region. But I wouldn't go as far as the claims that I've been hearing about there being a post-Wahhabi state in Saudi Arabia, or the push that the UAE has about its tolerance, or the whole notion of combating terrorism as being an officially stringent policy that they adhere to fully at the same time. Some would say that the Biden era has ushered a mass recalibration in the Gulf region. I hear this a lot in the West especially. But I hate to break the news, but really the mass recalibration has been ongoing and evolving for a while. Prior to Biden, I would time it with the counter-revolutionary push from 2013. So this mass recalibration continues unabated, and each state, rightly so, is pushing for its interests while trying to accommodate the interests of other states. The Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, has been handy in this regard, only when the various states make it effective. So last month we celebrated, or the GCC celebrated, its 40th anniversary, much fanfare, but it could be worth celebrating because it's the only functioning pan-Arab organization in a way. But as I mentioned in another talk, I really see the GCC as an entity that's going through a midlife crisis. It requires a serious reset in its charter and the way it operates among the member states and how they operate with their larger surroundings. Or else it will just become a place that tries to put out fires to no avail. One area where I think the GCC can prove useful is weighing in on the unnecessarily long Yemen war, now entering its 6th year. Ceasefire attempts, one after the other, nothing comes of it. I think we need to reimagine the path of peace, one that empowers Yemenis inside out, as opposed to having Gulf states focus on protecting their interests at the expense of Yemen. And that's one area that the GCC can lead through by pushing for Yemen's accession to the GCC. And I see this as a path towards sustainable peace for the larger Arabian Peninsula. It may seem odd, and I'm happy to discuss further, but I see immense benefits for both sides, Yemen and the GCC, in a 7-member GCC organization. But then you won't have Yemen or the Gulf benefit from an addiction to oil and gas, which is the case for years and years in the Gulf. We've been hearing about a post-oil future. Anyone living in the Gulf will tell you all these vision statements, billboards, but there has been inaction or timid type of reforms and highly growing budget deficits. Yes, the pandemic has affected some of that. Lower oil prices did too, but you really need integrated head-on reforms that take on the synergies of the different member states in the Gulf. And really, if you want those reforms to move through, you really need to engage with what ought to be the #1 priority for the region, which is people. And I'll end on that note. It goes without saying, but really, people matter. And this is not how several governments in the region and some, of their superpower partners see or treat Gulf citizens and residents. It's been an ongoing theme in several Gulf states. They try to market the contrary. But look, with youth under the age of 30 being over 60% of Gulf citizens, half of which are women, they really need to be taken into account. And that people-centric approach or outlook will not only be beneficial internally, I think it will also benefit Gulf-Iranian relations, Gulf-Turkish relations. It brings people in a better connected, synergistic way. We have seen, I mean, look, if they don't do that, people are going to do it on their own. And we've seen what happened when there was sweeping support by Gulf nationals on what happened in Gaza and Jerusalem a month ago. And that went even beyond official state lines in some of those Gulf states.
Mm-hmm.
So if they don't catch up with their own people, they're not going to see much benefit from evolving any processes or strategies. Same, for example, a few weeks ago, we had protests over unemployment in Oman. They haven't come to the level of the 2011 protests, and the demands were focused on economics, but there is no guarantee that a third wave of uprisings does not come back to the Gulf, just as it was in the case of other states 10 years ago. So where are we? I think the Gulf is in a stronger position compared to other countries in the region. We've had successfully run successions in the past year. There seems to be a kind of a topography of who's coming up next, and that matters. There is a growing military power, whether that's being used wisely or not is another issue. Yes, a challenged economic outlook, but still way better than the neighbors. And again, I mean, you have all the big media conglomerates in the Gulf. You name it, in Qatar or in Saudi or in the Emirates. And all of this can prove useful to the Gulf and its surroundings if they work on balancing their cards wisely. And I'll stop there.
Bader, thank you so much. You did go over time, but you had many more countries than probably most of us have to deal with. So I made that exception. I have one question that I think will bring out also a lot of what you had to say on a wider level and focusing in. You mentioned the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords were touted, as you know, as evidence of, little Sparta sort of pushing above it, hitting above its weight and punching above its weight, as it were, on a crucial Middle East issue. Certainly, it was marketed as such within different parts of the West. But I'm curious, as somebody who focuses on the Gulf quite particularly, how popular were these accords within the GCC? And I would be interested to know if there's any way to measure that with any degree of accuracy. But as far as you could tell, also against the backdrop of the latest flare-up of tensions and violence with the Israeli bombardment of Gaza only a few weeks ago. How popular were these really? And what does that mean for students and for academics as they try to gauge, how important these sorts of accords are within the region more generally?
Look, I mean, it's hard to gauge public opinion in some of the Gulf states just because of the different restrictions out there. But let me give you, and I'll step in a year or two before the Abrahamic Accords and I'll come back to it. If you remember, I don't know if you follow that, but some of the major media empires out there, and Ramadan is a big hot season for us, and they marketed certain series that tried to dabble with normalization with Israel as part of a fictional type drama in Ramadan. And because it was in the realm of fiction 2 years ago, I take the outcry that came from all the Gulf states very clearly as a sign of the lack of appeal. But once it became formalized, obviously, you're not going to be hearing a lot of protests in some countries. Although I must say, in Bahrain, there were marches on the streets. Over 25 civil society organizations protested. I know that the same happened in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Oman. So to deny that there is a mass unappreciation, and I'm putting very diplomatic words there, towards moving in a direction that does not represent the bulk of people. And it's clear from the beginning that it's a security arrangement, and one that has not proven its benefits, if I may, to Palestinians, as we saw 2 months ago.
Thank you so much for that. We will come back, I'm sure, to the Palestine question through questions and answers later on. But I'd like to turn over to our third panelist, Dr. Lina Khatib, whom I've already introduced and whom I look forward to hearing from in particular. Please, Lina.
Thank you so much. It's been actually a real pleasure to listen to my colleagues talk about Iran and the Gulf, because this feeds directly into what I wanted to talk about on the Levant. When we say the Levant, I'm really mainly speaking here about Syria and Lebanon. In the past, and as you said, a lot of the debate on Lebanon in particular would be framed through this issue of the Iranian-Saudi rivalry, with Lebanon seen as the plague rivalry between these two regional powers. I think we've moved on well beyond that now, and Syria is another example of that. When we look at how geopolitics in the region is affecting Lebanon, we'll see that there is only one external actor in the country, and that is basically Iran. It is Iran that is the most dominant external actor in Lebanon today. Saudi Arabia has mostly turned its attention to the Gulf region. It's concerned with its own borders, it's concerned with the Yemen conflict, and it's concerned with regional dynamics in the Gulf, more so than it is concerned with the Levant. Same with Syria. The Syrian conflict in the beginning was seen as an opportunity for Gulf actors like Qatar and Saudi Arabia to pursue their own interests, to maybe have the regime of Bashar al-Assad be replaced with one that is sympathetic to either Saudi or Qatar. However, this is not the case anymore. Neither Qatar nor Saudi Arabia is influential in Syria, or is actually even as they used to be, and being the most influential actor in the country. Once again, the priorities have shifted. So here we have a region, the Levant, that used to rely on funding, mainly from the Gulf for economic kind of assistance, where Gulf countries would, like the case of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Lebanon, sometimes be mediators and investing in these countries, especially in the case of Lebanon. That's no longer the case. You have Iran being dominant, as I said, in Lebanon. And in Syria, we have Iran and Russia. We shouldn't forget about Russia as a key geopolitical player that has a rising profile in the region. So we have to roll back and think, this happened, and why did it happen? And why is this situation the way it is today? And I personally attribute this mostly to US foreign policy. When it comes to the United States, the Syrian conflict was, for me, an opportunity for the US to respond to calls for change from the people of Syria, but the US chose instead to largely disengage in the context of Syria. And I attribute this in turn to the Obama administration's focus on getting a nuclear deal with Iran, which meant separating discussions on the deal from any debate on Iran's regional role. And meanwhile, the US did not pursue a diplomatic track to try to resolve the Syrian conflict. And this US disengagement opened up space for Russia to come and be right now the most influential external actor in Syria. So in Syria, unlike Lebanon, it's not Iran that's the most influential actor, it's Russia. So you have a new dynamic going on, disengagement from the US, disengagement from the Gulf, because they felt after the US in a way let them down, according to the Saudi and UAE point of view. They feel that they might as well focus their priorities elsewhere. And the most they could hope for the Levant is for it to be contained and not form a direct threat to their security. And if we look at the Biden administration today, we will see a kind of what I can see similarity when it comes to looking at the Levant, especially Iran's and Russia's involvement, as being more about containment rather than conflict resolution, or reversing this growth of influence for Russia and Iran. So it's a very different dynamic from the past, where you would see the US as a dominant actor seeking to pursue its interest at any cost, or the Gulf actors as regional influencers who also would seek to expand their influence in areas outside the Gulf. So what we're seeing instead is a compartmentalization in the geopolitics of the region. People, when it comes to these different countries, the actors, they address the region from the perspective of national security first for themselves. And also, they may well treat one particular rival in one way, in one context, and in another way, in another context. So everybody's compartmentalizing. So, for example, this whole issue of Iran being, seen as the all bad actor by Gulf countries is no longer the case. So UAE, for example, trades with Iran and is no longer interested in confronting Iran. It's more interested in de-escalating with Iran. And this is different from the absolute demonization of Iran that was rampant a few years ago. So we have a compartmentalization and we have the pursuit of pragmatism going on, with everyone saying, is this in my national interest? Is this a crucial issue for me as an urgent priority? And if not, then maybe the attention should go elsewhere. So just to close, when it comes to how this affects international studies of the region, again, I echo what has been said before about the need to abandon binaries when we look at the region. And I would urge for looking at pragmatism and compartmentalization as the two frameworks through which we can understand why these actors act in this particular way, which would explain why no one, for example, from the Gulf has run to the rescue of Lebanon economically, for instance, today, and why the Syrian regime is seeing signs of normalization being given by certain actors in the Gulf. And I will close it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lina. My question for you has to do about agency, because again, very often, as somebody who teaches about Middle Eastern politics, very often I'm trying to contextualize different happenings in the region for students, for policymakers, without downplaying the human agency on the ground, while at the same time recognizing that a lot of powers have interests in the region and they try to push certain agendas, and indeed within the region itself, right? So the Saudis in Lebanon, the Egyptians in Libya, and so on and so on and so on. My question to you is how much emphasis should we be placing on the importance of these axes, on the importance of these external actors as compared to human agency on the ground from the populations themselves?
Thank you. I think that's a very important point, and really thank you for raising it, because the risk in talking about geopolitics is assuming that no one on the ground has any agency, that it's all a game determined by these big players. And yes, as I said, to a large degree, the big players, whether they act or not, has an impact. So that's the thing. When I talk about US disengagement, inaction has consequences and implications. It's not, it's not the same as being neutral. It has an impact, an active one. But when it comes to the people of the region, one of the key issues with Lebanon in particular is how, unfortunately, a lot of Western, maybe policymakers I talk to, seem to think that the status quo in Lebanon is there to stay, and that there's no point trying to support alternative voices, because ultimately the country is in effect not sovereign. So in a way, who cares about what happens on the ground? And I think that's a very erroneous and dangerous view. And this is why, when it comes to, again, international studies, I think it's so important to approach the region through a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary lens. When you look on the ground in Lebanon, yes, the situation may appear hopeless. However, there are movements towards political party formation in the country, and this is new. There are movements towards syndicates and unions trying to play a bigger role, although they don't have the infrastructure yet to play a bigger role politically, but there's at least an attempt. There is more awareness amongst the youth population of the dangers of the sectarian political system in the country. Same with Syria. People say, oh, it's a lost cause, that's it, the regime has survived. But when, again, you look at the situation on the ground, even in regime-held areas, there are people still trying to carve a space for themselves in a very micro way, perhaps, but it is important. So anyone who says there's no alternative to the regime should look at what's happening on the ground, whether in Lebanon or in Syria. So yes, it's very important to talk about human agency. And yes, these people may not have the capacity today to completely change the system, but you need to start somewhere. And let's be realistic. And this is an argument that applies to the Arab Spring uprisings and this whole debate on whether it was a failure or not. You cannot really realistically expect regimes that have been in place for decades and power dynamics that have been in place sometimes for centuries to suddenly transform into viable democracies overnight. So I think what we're witnessing in Syria and Lebanon is the beginning. And yes, it may be small, but it is worth supporting and worth paying attention to. And that is something that definitely not just scholars, but policymakers should heed.
Thank you so much, Lina. And I particularly like that last point that you made. We'll come back to that, I think, later on. Our final panelist, Dr. Ziya Meral, who is also my colleague, I'm happy to say, at RUSI. And I'm looking forward very much to hearing what he has to say about Turkey, the wider region. Please, Ziya, take it away.
Thank you so much, Hisham. I think I really quite like all of our approaches actually in this conversation. And a lot of it boils down to a refusal of framing an analysis of a country from our own concerns and our own perceptions. And that, I think, is a fundamental problem that we often see, even in academic literature. You know, those countries are really big and really complex, and they have so many factors shaping their domestic politics, their regional policies, their global engagement, but we seem to pick up multiple things that only interest us. I think when it comes to Turkey, you see that kind of analytic shortcoming in two common trends, right? So one stream of analyzing Turkey is representation, like neo-Ottomans, you know, popped up again, you know, a bit like a furniture line. Hey, this is the latest trend, you know, more as if there is this kind of intrinsic ontology of being a Turk that kind of gives them a new push to conquer the lands that the Ottoman Empire had. Because that's a very appealing opinion editorial trick that kind of represents an aggressive entity called Turkey that just basically is on a, you know, riding horses and just invading places. That's very tempting. It's really attractive as an opinion editorial, analytically total nonsense, and it explains nothing, right? And our challenge is understanding how Ankara sees the world, how it seeks to respond to it, how it forms its decisions, what its scopes are, and then we can pass a personal judgment of what we like or not and what portfolio. That's a different conversation. But from an analytic perspective, that representation polemical line doesn't give us anything. And then the other end, which I'm really exhausted, and it feels like for a decade I wasted so much of my brain cells on it, is reduction in the vacuum. What I mean is it's about Erdogan, right? So everything goes down to Erdogan. And Erdogan emerges as a man on a chair holding a white cat, stroking it and saying, look, what can I do today to problematize the world and to explain the whole country by focusing on Erdogan? Obviously, at no time than ever in Turkish history, foreign policy and even domestic power is centralized on one man. So there is now, more than ever actually, an argument to make that Erdogan is the basically center of the storm. He does basically hold the power. He does decide on a lot of things. But the problem is Erdogan is also responds to opportunities and challenges. He's got a bureaucratic machinery underneath him. He's got interest groups he balances. He's got political alliances that keeps him. He's at his weakest politically. So all the ratings have shown that about him. And he's also vulnerable to global trends. So we do away with all of these complexities. We just want to talk about Erdogan, his ideology, his outlook, and etc. So that's the challenge of cacophony of all these perspectives, and you brush it aside. So I think at its core, Turkish foreign policy, Turkish approach to Middle East, Turkish understanding of Middle East has been very reactionary and very inconsistent. Number one, for the last 10 years or so, you know, I was there in Egypt in 2004, 2005 during the outreach with Mubarak and followed it every year, for example. You could see how Turkey was learning the Middle East again, right? They didn't really engage diplomatically. They didn't really have a bigger stake in the conversations, except some tensions towards Iraq vis-a-vis the PKK networks. In '99, they almost invaded Syria again for the same reasons of PKK activities in that land that was attacking them. But that was pretty much that. And so you see now with the quote-unquote Arab Spring 2011, post-2011, and the Syrian war, they were put in a position of formulating a policy that is often contradictory, full of changes and full of strategic calculations, as well as a complex series of tensions. So on one hand, you see Turkey sometimes acting very traditionally as a state, following what I often use offensive realism as a, drawing from the international relations kind of theory textbook, explaining how Ankara sees anarchy on its borders. Look what's happening in Syria. Look at what's happening in Iraq. Look at what's happening in all these areas, including the Med. Look at what's happening in global affairs with China, with Indo-Pacific, with US lack of interest in the region. I need to assert myself. That's the only way I can be on the negotiating table as Russia is back in the Middle East, as all these things are being decided that has huge impact for me and for my future. I need to be assertive, and I need to do that not via just diplomacy. I need hard power to demonstrate that Turkey is capable of hurting you. Turkey is capable of putting a spook in the wheel, if not change the direction of your policy. There is a lot of that, right? There is a lot of perception of the developments in its region as Turkey is stuck, cornered, needs to assert itself. Otherwise, all these alliances between UAE, Egypt, Greece, Israel, Cyprus, Saudi Arabia on one hand, US attention on the other hand, Russian assertions on the other hand, otherwise Turkey will be run over and they can't let it. So that offensive realism kind of perspective is very ingrained at the moment. And once the hammer becomes the solution, obviously then every nail you see are drones, Turkish Navy, Turkish military. So now Turkey is getting used to, for the first time in its history, operations abroad as a foreign policy assertion. I mean, this is a lot of new stuff that has unfolded on the AKP last 4 or 5 years. We didn't really see that before in Turkish history. So that's really interesting to observe, opening of bases in the Horn of Africa and Libya and Qatar. Those are all new developments in Turkish history. Again, boils down to offensive realism and wanting to be a regional actor that has a say. And the only way it can have a say is to assert itself. That's their reading. You can be the judge of values of that. But the second contradiction to that is sometimes it's extremely personalized and sometimes it's counterintuitively domestic politics driven, right? Not a cold-hearted realpolitik calculation of what's in Turkey's interests, but it's either a personal relationship that we're aware of or not aware, like Turkey-Qatar relationship had a lot of personalized aspects to it, like how Turkey didn't want to get sucked into the GCC crisis, went down to Kuwait, and they said, come, you can have a cup of tea, but you're not the one who's going to be negotiating this between Qatar and the GCC. And there was a lot of personalized relationships between the royal family in Qatar and Erdogan that really actually put Turkey in a particular box. But unlike the more complex state reactions on Syria, it's not a personalized reaction, it's a complete complexity of Turkish state responding to Syria. And then domestic politics kick in and corners Erdogan and policymakers, right? You've seen that with Egypt. After the ousting of Morsi and all the events that follow, it put them into a corner they haven't been able to walk down till recently. And they're trying to walk down from it, but it's not necessarily working because Cairo has other interests, but it has changed. With Israel, they've done it. You know, they get really close, and then Mavi Marmara flotilla issue happened when Turkish citizens were killed by Israeli forces, and then they tried to approach again, and then they, et cetera, et cetera. So you see that dynamic of domestic politics continually taking them back to taking positions because Erdogan needs to rally towards a religious nationalist constituency, not necessarily Islamist, but religious nationalist constituency that forms the bulk of his voters. And it needs the alignment of these two large groups to deliver that. So what does it leave us? I think we underestimate the impact of US on the way that things have reacted in Turkish foreign policy. Just like Lina said, the absence of certain issues like Syria, for example, the impact of Syria and Arab Spring on Turkey has really been underlooked. How did it shape the country's domestic politics, its foreign policy? US is focused on Northeast Syria through fighting a fight with YPG without thinking about what it means overall, etc. Really put Turkey into another trajectory in foreign policy. EU is another aspect of this conversation we don't talk about much, but how they handled Turkey and regional things had a huge impact on how Turkey and Russia, how Russia has entered the Middle East again. And for Turkey, then it became a question of Black Sea, Crimea, now East Med and Caucasus, Russian presence in Syria, in Libya, in other areas of Turkish activity that has really put pressure on Ankara to see how do you manage this complex relationship of having the need to work with Russia, but also contain it. So I think from Ankara's perspective, What you are witnessing now is an often incoherent policy, often reactionary foreign policy, but often one that is driven by a desire to be an independent regional power that has a say on the developments of its region, that is taken seriously by regional and international actors, and is not going to let things developing in the region, in Syria or in Libya or over Cyprus, to basically put it in a corner. So that blended with very personalized policymaking at the moment and domestic political reasons, I think makes Turkey a fascinating country to observe, and one that gives you a lot of white hair with sudden shifts and changes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ziya. You've reminded me that, I think I've had more white hair in the past few years than I've had in the past sort of decade and a half. And I put that down at least partially to politics in the region and following them. So on Turkey, the question I have for you is that obviously with the departure of the Trump administration, and I think it was really the departure of the Trump administration as opposed to the presence of a Biden one, the calculus in Ankara for how it can move forward in the region, I think certainly sped up in a certain way, a quickening, if you will, which I think we've seen with Egypt and with others, as you mentioned. I'm curious to know from your perspective, though, how likely do you think that it is that Ankara is going to be able to roll back a lot of these tensions that have developed with places like Egypt, places like Israel, places like Saudi and the and the United Arab Emirates, because they've certainly made these overtures quite publicly. And yes, things flared up. So obviously, when following during the Gaza bombardment, the rhetoric changed, but I don't think that's changing actually the overall calculus within Ankara. I think that they do want to build a more close relationship with the Israelis. So how likely do you think it is they're going to be successful in this, sort of overture kind of exercise across the region?
I think not that much, actually. So obviously any attempt to normalize these tensions are welcome, right? The region doesn't need any more escalation or any more risks. So I always support and positively, Turkish approach towards Egypt is more than welcome. Easing your relations with Israel, even though you're raising your concerns, is welcome. With United States, Turkish-US relations are at their historically low, let's not break it today fully kind of mode, right? So it could happen any other week. And it will have huge knock-on implications on so many other issues that we are concerned with. So all of these are welcome, but unless Turkey changes a dramatic attitude and language and policymakers and public kind of stand, I can't see how most of these can be solved. I think Erdogan is an foreign policy elite in Ankara are aware of it, right? There are limitations. And I think they have used Turkey's geopolitical capital bank account, the credits that you gain by being an important country by virtue of your geography and positioning and all the factors. I think Turkey has used all of that credit in DC, in European capitals, in Middle Eastern capitals. So everybody looks at pretty much Turkey as we can't let it go worse anymore. Let's just stop it here. And that's a very bad place for diplomacy, right? So when everybody approaches you, we shouldn't just let it get worse. Let's just draw a line here so that it doesn't get worse. I think it's a very difficult thing. And I think ultimately for Ankara, the main focus is economy. Economy is really not doing well. That underwrites a lot of Turkish foreign policy reach, but also political legitimacy. That's not going well. And again, for example, with Libya issue and questions over Cyprus and the whole Greece kind of Israel relationship, they really do feel those developments will really deny Turkey majority of the Mediterranean Sea and agency. I mean, they will literally be limited to the shoreline, which obviously I can understand why they react to it. But because of all the historical complexities, they put themselves in a very weak position that pushes them to react that aggressively. Will they be able to solve things with Greece, with current politics and economics? Cyprus will never be united. So it's a bit like one of these kind of two-state solution with Palestine seems more implausible every day, but Cyprus unifying has died a long time ago. So it's interesting to see them talking about a two-state for Cyprus rather than actually a unification. But again, I get that as a diplomatic messaging. So I think no matter what normalization message they send at the moment, it's only a temporary easing, public easing of issues, but the deeper geopolitical issues, priorities remain.
Thank you so much. So we've entered into the discussion portion of the afternoon, or the early evening, as it were, and I wanted to start it off by throwing out a question that I direct to all of you to give your thoughts on. I haven't told you any of these questions, so I'm putting you all on the spot at once. I'm taking that prerogative, and it's a geopolitics question, and it's really quite simple. What sort of budding new alliances do you see from your own vantage points at the moment, which you think will become more formalized in the coming 5-10 years? Or are we staying really where we are? When it comes to the present set of axes and poles in the region, I think there were quite a lot of signs several years before they became crystallized. Are we seeing other signs that happen today that we need to keep track of for the next few years? And please, anybody, I'd love to hear from all of you if you have any thoughts.
Okay, I'll go first. And Bader, if you may allow me to walk a little bit on the map in your direction and talk about the Gulf. One of the interesting alliances is that of UAE with Israel, along with, of course, Bahrain and others. And I expect this kind of alliance to grow with time, despite all the challenges that were recently highlighted through what happened in Gaza and Jerusalem. But I think this is a security arrangement that is likely to grow for as long as, in my view, US foreign policy continues to ignore Iran's regional role. I think the Iranian issue has been a driving force behind this alliance, more so than the Palestinian issue. If anything, this alliance sadly shows how the Palestinian issue has become kind of, in a way, removed from engagement with Israel for countries like UAE and others. And I think it's because of the geographical proximity of UAE and Iran. UAE in particular feels that it is vulnerable and that it wants to do whatever it can to strengthen its own security, but also gain brownie points with the US. So in a way, it's hitting two birds with one stone with this alliance with Israel, so that it can be seen as this actor that is close to these two countries, and in a way, send a sign to Iran that would encourage de-escalation rather than, engaging with the Iranian threat through confrontation. And I expect this dynamic to grow with time. So in a way, while Iran may not have more allies as such, I think in a kind of passive way, it is going to benefit from these kinds of alliances that are meant to be a deterrent, but ultimately also pave the way for Iran to increase its own activities and influence in the Levant. So we're seeing a bit of a shift. And I think here, we may well eventually see a kind of Israel.
I think we've temporarily lost Lina for a moment. She did mention that she had a couple of connection issues, but she actually gave us something very interesting for us to consider until she comes back, which is about this particular new alliance that indeed is developing. And I wanted Badr, if he would, to come in on this, because there's a thread here that I'm wondering is really a thread or is just wishful thinking on social media. But maybe you'd be able to enlighten us further, which is on how much the continuation and sustainability of the Abraham Accords is actually something to be taken for granted or not. Because certainly on social media, what we saw over the past few weeks and couple of months is, a very careful, I wouldn't say orchestrated, but a very careful expression of support for the Palestinians from Emiratis who previously were silent until it became clear that space had opened up, even if a little bit, to express their opposition to the Israelis and to what was happening in Jerusalem and Gaza. I have no way to gauge that. It could just be a tiny little bubble on Twitter. It could be a lot more people within the Emirati population. It's very difficult to gauge, but it did seem that there was something there. And these weren't exiles. These were people in country who were taking what they saw at least is an opportunity for them to express dissent on this particular issue, which I found quite interesting. And I'm wondering if there's anything really there, if it's just a bunch of wishful thinking, and perhaps you could give us your thoughts on that.
No, look, I agree with what Lina has said about seeing what shape of alliance that this is going to take us through. The UAE has taken a conscious decision to activate something that's been, an open secret for many years, not only with the UAE, but with several, Gulf countries. I mean, the first trade attaché in the region was in Qatar and Oman in the 90s, post-Oslo. So, I mean, this is not something hidden. And I see the way that the UAE operates is that both issues can coexist, right? So they can maintain their support for a two-state solution, and even, when push comes to shove, take on escalatory behaviors towards Israel in terms of either reprimanding the ambassador or pushing all of this. But this event in the last 2 months, this catastrophic war, was too early in the honeymoon for them to take such action. I think they will do that. They'll try to balance things out, and it is security first. And let me throw this out because it's gonna sound funny, but I think, look, with US being unclear about their priorities and them moving east, there needed to be some kind of solutions that are local. And what the UAE has done is really takes from the Iranian manual, if you may. I mean, how can I be a sort of a nuance to other countries in the region by building alliances that can push the other countries on guard? And the Iranians, they've been trying to, go through different countries, meddle in on different files, and the UAE has followed through. I mean, Yemen is one clear example, and I can give you a list of other countries. But I think that security relationship is there to stay and grow, and hopefully one day the argument that came about that this will help push the Palestinian cause, maybe not right now, I don't see it, but eventually maybe they can play a role in domestic politics, although they decided not to do anything along those fronts in the last incident.
Dina, I get the impression that you have something you want to come in on here, and I think that's entirely in order, because we have talked a lot about Iran, and there's a lot of I won't say speculation, but it's assessments from people from outside. So perhaps you could give us your own take on how does this all work in terms of your analytical lens on the region?
Sure. So maybe I'll give the Iran angle first, and then I'll expand on the initial question that you asked as well. In terms of the way that Iran perceives these alliances, I mean, I completely agree with what's been said so far. I do think that these alliances were largely, particularly the Emirati one, largely in response to the Iranian threat and the need for these countries to do something for themselves to secure themselves. It's interesting because in Iran, it was seen on the one hand as proof that Iran is a great country that frightens everybody in the region. And then on the other hand, actually, so at the beginning, Iran saw it that way. Over the course of a few weeks, a couple months, when you started to see in particular, not so much the economic and trade ties or the tourism that was going between the two countries or anything like that, but the real open, transparent kind of build up on the military front, the military cooperation, the cooperation in intelligence sharing, things like giving Israel access to the Persian Gulf and to ports in the Persian Gulf and stuff like that. That started to frighten Iran a little bit. And Tehran started to kind of take these accords a little bit more seriously. Obviously, there's not much that it can do, particularly, again, in light of what I was saying earlier, given everything that's going on the JCPOA front, but it is kind of watching it closely now to figure out what's going to come of these accords and whether they really will be a threat to Iran in the way that I think the Emiratis and the Bahrainis in particular intended it to. In terms of the accords themselves, again, completely agree with what was said, but I will add one thing. I think it's absolutely right that this will become a budding alliance partnership, that they will work closely together, no matter the challenges that these countries face, especially in the case of the UAE. But I have my doubts about the likelihood that this model will spread to other countries in the Gulf. I think there's a lot more nervousness forget Saudi for a second, even in a country like Oman, and Bader, I'd be really interested in your take on this, but even in a country like Oman, there's real nervousness about making public any dealing that they've had with Israel other than, a state visit here and there. So I'm not sure I think the current relationships will deepen, but I'm not sure the same model will expand. There is another interesting alliance or relationship or whatever you want to call it that I think we should be watching out for. And that's the one that Iran and the Gulf Arab countries both have with Russia and China. So this whole looking east thing, it's not just an Iranian thing. It's now very much become a Gulf thing as well. And I think that that's definitely something to watch. There was a lot of noise made about the 25-year deal between Iran and China. Ultimately, I think it was more noise than it was substance. But it was a little bit of a catch-up effort so that Iran could catch up to the kind of deals that the Gulf Arabs had with the Chinese and make sure it wasn't being left behind, especially because Iran actually stands to gain a lot more from having China on its side. And I think that's definitely something. China's role in the region, even Russia's role, but Russia, we've seen it a little bit more openly. So China's role in the region is going to be really interesting to watch. Will that role eventually become one that's a little bit more political than it is right now? I think the Chinese want to avoid it for as long as they can. But I think there's going to come a point where they won't be able to avoid it anymore.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm glad that you brought the China question up, because China sort of brings out a lot the also religion instrumentalization of the region as well, because of all of the places on this planet where Muslims are being persecuted for their religious identity, China definitely ranks at the top of that. And just yesterday, there was a very interesting interview done with Imran Khan of Pakistan through an Axios reporter, where, the reporter really sort of hammers the point home about how Pakistan and China are allies. What about the Uyghur Muslim situation in China? And Imran Khan, the prime minister, just sort of deflects as much as humanly possible. And it reminded me, as we were going through this conversation, that, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran, the Saudis, the guardians of the Haramain, of the two most holy sites for Muslims worldwide. Nearly all of these countries, if not all of these countries, have Islam as the constitution of the state, etc., 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 etc. And none of them have said anything about the Uyghurs. And on the contrary, many of them signed statements in support of China against criticism that was levied about the Uyghurs. So, I do think that's interesting to see how they're going to sort of get around that over the coming years, because I do think that China is going to have much more of a role as it leverages the economic capital that it's invested in the region for political purposes. And I'm sure at some point it will do so a lot more powerfully than it's done so far.
But also, just to add to that, if you'll let me,
please, of course.
I think, oh God, now I've lost my train of thought.
It's okay.
Never mind. You'll come back to me if I remember it.
We're here for another 15 minutes. So if it comes back, then please let me know. There was another question I want to throw out here, which relates to, so far we've been talking about how, things are minimizing in terms of damage, like they're going down in terms of damage in certain places. And it struck me, we often take that for granted as analysts, that, let's just try to get things calmer. Let's try to reduce tensions, which I'm not saying this is bad, but it's certainly not something that I hope is an inescapable conclusion, that the best we can hope for is just to minimize damage. Do we have any arenas or places where we think there's possibilities for any of these actors to actually embark on positive change, to push forward positive impacts within the region, as opposed to just hoping that they don't make more of a mess than they've made so far? Ziya, you're a very happy person. I want you to take that question.
Sorry, Hisham. I was just distracted about it. Look, So ultimately, I don't think anybody in the region is in kind of drive to make things worse for themselves, right? So everybody's trying to find a way to balance all these contradictory things that are developing. So you have the global picture, you have US policy heading one direction, China issues emerging, you have regional actors. To what extent the regional countries now want to escalate their problems, I'm no longer certain. That's actually good, right? So 2 years ago, I think we saw a lot more adventure taking from people like Saudi Arabia's policies, even Turkey's policies, even Iranian activities. There was a lot more adventure in terms of what they were willing to assert and where in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, and then etc. So I think the COVID-19, the economic implications around the region, and the US foreign policy or lack of it or interest or changes with the Biden, I think it's put a stop on some of these things. So in some sense, I think often I feel, well, there could be a breakthrough positively in some portfolios, like for example, the enrichment deal. I mean, obviously, if only we had a crystal ball and we could guess what will happen. But the JPCO, I think, I mean, are we going to have a new breakthrough over Iran question? I don't know, maybe. I mean, it depends how much US is willing to go that direction. I do worry about East Med escalation over Cyprus in energy and the new alliances and what that means. But at the same time, I also think because of the current context in the region, I think countries are a lot more inclined to contain the fallouts and risks than they are to actually fuel them at this stage. Now, that doesn't mean that's going to continue, but compared to 3 years ago, I'm a bit calmer. But Iran elections, Israel elections, what is this all going to mean vis-a-vis two countries with a different trajectory and kind of mimetic twins in this escalation between themselves? Economic issues in Turkey definitely shapes it. But if something happens again over Cyprus, what is that going to mean? I'm not sure. But I'm actually a bit positive this year on containing some of these fallouts.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the Israeli elections again. It's been fascinating to watch. Not I have to say, for the reasons that I think a lot of our colleagues in DC and elsewhere are talking about, that, you know, thank God Bibi Netanyahu is gone. You could be forgiven for thinking that the guy who took over is actually some sort of, you know, radical left winger. He's actually far more to the right than Netanyahu, but intriguingly has a component in his government that's actually Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood is banned in most countries in the region, but it's actually in government in Israel, which I find fascinating, just as an academic sort of exercise. There is something that came up in among our audience, which again relates to Israel. And the question is this: do you think that Israel will replace the United States in the Gulf area? And presumably talking here about, you know, the changing security architecture in the region. And wouldn't this escalate the tension with Iran? And it raises an interesting point just in terms of how the dynamics are changing somewhat. Even though I also agree with Dina that I don't think that there's going to be many people that join these accords, many other countries that join these accords. In fact, quite frankly, the existing quote-unquote signatories, I don't think are equal. I think that when it comes to the accords, it's really the Emiratis by and large. The Bahrainis I don't really see in the same way at all. And then the other countries that are sort of lumped along with it, they're far more limited arrangements. You know, when it comes to the Moroccans, the nature of that quote-unquote normalization, I think, is going to be very minimal. And has everything to do with, you know, recognition of Western Sahara. The Sudanese, frankly, seem to have been blackmailed into it, and it's all conditional on as yet to be elected Sudanese assembly actually ratifying it whenever it becomes a reality, when it's actually ever elected. But that question, I think, is still a pertinent one. Will Israel try to replace the U.S. in the Gulf arena? I don't see it, but perhaps I'm missing something. Anybody?
I mean, not quite. That's not the way that the relationship is structured. If you ask the Emiratis or the Saudis, when they took those decisions, or at least with the Abrahamic Accord for the Emiratis, it's them wanting to have their destiny in their own hands. And if they're going to find any ally that can get them there, including the Israelis, they're going to go for it. And I think what Lina mentioned earlier about the pragmatism is key on point, because the channels with Turkey are opening up, mainly through Saudi and Egypt, but the UAE is listening. They're open to any kind of, assortment. The same could be said with Iran. So national interest comes first. How can we deal with a region that's been addicted to foreign power structures that have been around for, decades and decades on? Could there be a kind of a security architecture that's local, quote unquote? Because we're talking about, supplementing those countries with US military hardware. We're talking about there being that proxy war between the US and China over who's going to take what, and we don't want this to happen in our turf. We've seen this happen earlier in Turkey. There could be another remake in the UAE and so on. So it's an evolving story, but it's an interesting pitch that the Emiratis are putting out as they celebrate their 50th year of unification later this year in December. So what kind of image do they want to put out? And I think if you ask them, they're happy where they're at and they're pushing for more.
I have a question that I wanted to throw out also to all of you, which is, this year is also the 10th anniversary of the Arab uprisings as well. And we know that the problems that underscored those uprisings a decade ago, they didn't disappear. Those problems exist. They continue to exist. They've been exacerbated in many countries that are actually far worse than they were in 2010 and 2011. And we've seen other uprisings take place over the last couple of years, not least in Sudan, to a lesser extent in Algeria. But that still leaves quite a large kind of region. And I'm cautious about just, grouping the region in one sort of, big set of places as though they all face the same challenges. But I do think that there's a common theme on one level, which is that there's this unfinished business from the quote-unquote post-colonial kind of period. Do we see any places in the region where we expect there to be new uprisings, new upheavals, including in countries that have already experienced them and they didn't go so well, or places that haven't seen them at all? And please, that's for anybody.
That's a very difficult question, obviously, to forecast. But if you looked at the protests in Tunisia, I think, last 6 nights or so last week, that has been unfolding with the brutality, the video that emerged that the police officers were beating a young man, and the reactions that it caused. And I think there's already a sense of a lot of protests that we are seeing in Tunisia that not everything is okay, actually. So there is a lapse in police brutality and accountability. I think a lot of the social issues that triggered those mass protests in 2011 all across the region, including in Turkey, by the way, there were mass protests, have not disappeared because they were focused on governance and equal future and economic opportunities, rule of law. So those core issues, I think, are still there across the region. And obviously, even in Turkey, if you look at the intensity of polarization, identity politics, and grievances, people did have those protests around Gezi Park in Istanbul in the same era, and that attacked them back really effectively, that people left the country or got imprisoned or lost their jobs or internalized that. I think there's a lot of discontent, but I think for Turkey, I don't think it will be mass protests in that direction, but some people do actually signal a much more precarious political era ahead of us, with weakened votes for AKP, them not wanting to go in coalition governments, continual kind of ways trying to address that, and continual discontent. I think Turkey is going to be a bit more precarious than we assume it will be, but not that kind of Arab Spring imagery.
Dina, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I mean, I think you could say the same as well for Iranians, honestly. The situation is going to be a lot more precarious, especially after the elections, the election results that we saw on Friday with Ebrahim Raisi, a hardliner, coming in at least for the next 4 years and likely for the next 8, because you don't really get a lot of one-term presidents in Iran. I think there's a real sense of, again, political exhaustion, fatigue across Iran amongst the population. There's a sense of hopelessness that, you know, what more can we do? We can't, elections won't make a difference. The system is the system. It doesn't want to change. No matter how much we push, nothing really comes out of it. And then I think Iranians themselves are also grappling with the idea of wanting more aggressive change. From their perspective, again, the last time that they pushed for really aggressive change, they ended up with the Islamic Republic, and it didn't exactly go the way that many Iranians had envisaged their politics basically going. So there's a fear about an overhaul of the Islamic Republic. I don't think that Iranians want that. And of course, these are gross generalizations. You know, that's my first caveat. But generally, there's fear of the unknown. And you can see that. You can see because they're really struggling to mobilize behind people. There's not much of an opposition, whether it's inside or outside the country. There are a couple figureheads here and there, but you know, they might have some core diehard supporters, but beyond that, it doesn't really go anywhere. And inside Iran, I think the idea remains, although things may change in the next few years, I think the idea remains that we would rather have reform of the system than any major complete overhaul of it. Because again, they're afraid of what that will lead to. I do think that we'll have to wait and see what happens, at least in the first couple of years of a Raisi presidency, because it'll either be much more of the same, or it really will be a pretty significant swing to a more hardline kind of society. And I think if it is that, then it's a real misreading of the sentiment of the Iranian public, because I'm not sure that they would be able to handle that for very long. But again, all of this is speculation.
Okay. I'm going to invite our panelists to give us their final thoughts, because we're running up to the end of this 90-minute panel. But just really in 1 minute or less, anything that you'd like our audience at BISA, and for those who will be viewing this afterwards, outside of the conference, because it will be made public, last thoughts on what you think they ought to be keeping their eyes on going forward. I'll start with Ziya.
Look, I think one key takeaway is, and again, as all of you were talking, is how desperate we are for new theoretical approaches to conceptualize the region, right? Or what's happening domestically, how they're being shaped by regional and global developments that helps us move on beyond representation or caricaturization and kind of presenting these larger than life individual political characters as if they perform in a vacuum. So I think if anyone wiser than me could usher us into much more grounded discussions on the region beyond, again, perspectives emerging from US or Europe in terms of their own framed questions about what matters in the region, I think that would actually be really, really helpful to understand the region on its own terms through the eyes of the people. And then policymakers can ask that question vis-a-vis their interests. So if anybody has any of these new theoretical approaches that can help us, please do email me. I'm desperate to find some conversation partners along the way.
Thank you, Gandalf. Lina, please. We lost you for a little bit, but I'm so glad we managed to get you back. I hope that the connection holds. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about the connection earlier, the joy of Zoom. Well, actually, I'm glad you asked about where we might see protests next. And then we heard from a perspective on Turkey and a perspective on Iran. That is refreshing, because usually the focus is on the Arab world and from the outdated framework of Arab exceptionalism. So the takeaway I want people to think about is such thing as Arab exceptionalism. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lina. I'll be coming back to that. Badr and then Dina, please.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll end with what I ended my initial comments on is, and Hisham picked up on that with a question to Lina concerning, I mean, look, people matter, and we cannot have those countries operating in absence or divorced from what's happening on the ground. One needs to feed onto the other. And this hasn't necessarily been the case in a lot of the countries that we study. And the more disconnect there is, the more despair, the more agony, and the more frustration down the line. So that's one thing that we need to look into. And I welcome Lina's encouragement to expand our lenses of inquiry. I mean, we Arabs are not in an island, but we have to operate within, the larger scale. And many of the changes, I mean, I'm less optimistic, and I'll end with this than Ziya. I think what we're seeing today, yes, it's like you have a soccer match and the players have the, in between the break. I think that's where we're at. And unfortunately, there could be an escalation down the line if certain countries don't get their way through in how they want to push the region or their vision of the region moving forward.
Dina, please.
Thanks. I think I would really encourage those who work on the region not to fall into the trap of just the dualities that you have in the region, which I think was mentioned earlier. But really, that is the thing that I want to highlight. This whole, it's Sunni versus Shia, it's the US versus Iran. It's I think that means that we end up missing a lot of the nuances of what's going on in the region. I would also encourage everybody not to listen to official statements ever, because they don't reflect what is actually going on behind the scenes. So that's the other one. And then I would actually end on a slightly more optimistic note, which is odd because usually I'm the pessimist in any group. And I think I'm actually quite encouraged by the different dialogues, conversations that we've seen with states in the region that hasn't depended so much on the US calling for these dialogues, but rather countries in the region taking responsibility and engaging in these conversations, even if the conversations are super limited and very tactical and may very well not lead to anything. I still think that given the tensions and the suspicions in the region, any dialogue, any FaceTime is good. So even dialogue for the sake of dialogue is good. It may not lead to anything right now, but hopefully in the long term, it'll help resolve some of our problems.
Thank you, Dina. I want to end on echoing your point, but also Lina's point, which is this whole point about Arabic sectionalism. I think it's incredibly important that, as we look at the region, as we analyze the region, as we try to understand the region, that as Bader pointed out, this is a region of people. We all too often reduce and are incredibly reductionist about how we look at all of these different countries and these nations and peoples, and say, they need a strong man because they're so disorganized or they have so much diversity and so on. They can't do democracy. Democracy would be a terrible idea for them. And it's a sentiment that I frankly find, to be almost a bigotry of low expectations. And very often it is, frankly, just plain old bigotry. That we should be able to look deeper than that and recognize that actually what we've seen over the past decade or so, we can see as evidence of chaos, but also evidence of people who just want a better future for themselves and for their children and their grandchildren. And they're willing to fight for it. So I thank all of you for having attended and participating in this conversation. On behalf of BISA and the RUSI, please give yourselves all a round of applause for being with us. And again, I appreciate all of your time. Don't forget, everybody in the audience, to continue to tune in to the rest of the panels that BISA is offering over the next couple of days. It's a big set of panels over the next couple of days through this conference, and I'm sure that you'll find them all worthwhile. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.